Hey guys, how's it going? Avishai here with another episode of What Israel Is. Um, Today I want to speak about the Israeli left, and I've said it before. I'm a leftist. I know it may be somehow hard to digest, seeing as how I actually hold the view that Israel has a right to exist and to the right of self-determination, but I am a leftist. I believe that the occupation is unjust, and I believe in all sorts of economical support that the state owes the people. I'm not a socialist per se, and I believe that both socialists and the type of Ayn Rand libertarians are simply dealing with fictions, with ideologies, essentially. Stuff that cannot be, that cannot be realized in the real world. So I suppose I'm a social democrat or whatever. I want to talk not simply about the Israeli left, but rather about the what used to be the ruling party in Israel and is today relegated to the second biggest party in Israeli politics, and one that is always either in the opposition, so never voted into office, or comes crawling into the coalition. That is the Israeli Labor Party. And the Israeli Labor Party is currently in a very sad state of affairs and has been for about 16 years or so. But there is a history to be told there. It is a history of how an undisputed ruling party came to lose everything. So, one thing that I often hear from anti-Zionist or anti-Israeli Facebook or net activists, couch activists, is how it's not right that Israel is doing what it is because they just swooped in and took land. Historically, this is very far from actually depicting what happened. Jews did not just swoop in and take land, and they certainly didn't do that in 45. By May 45, there was essentially a state, an unrecognized state that was being run within the territories of the British Mandate of Palestine, and it was a state that was run by Jews and populated by hundreds of thousands of Jews. And this state was, the foundations of this state were laid by a party, a political party named the Israeli Laborers, the Israeli Laborers Party, essentially. This party was defined as a Zionist socialist party. And if that sounds like a point of contention to you, it's very much so. They were founded on adherence to two ideologies that were not necessarily you couldn't necessarily reconcile between the two. And one is Marxist socialism, and the second is nationalism. And please, if you have any jokes about National Socialism, obviously they're very funny, but you know. The idea here was that they will run the country in a socialist manner with regards to economics, with regards to the amount of control that the government has over the system. With regards to incentives and making sure that people will have a starting point to build from, and welfare and all of that. But they were also Zionist in the sense that they were committed to the founding of a Jewish state, a Jewish nation state. Things did not go smoothly, though, as far as reconciling between this Zionism and socialism. There were dissenting parties of socialist parties in pre-Israel Jewish the Jewish community, and those were actually demanding allegiance to the USSR and to Stalin. This was an idea that was very far from what the leadership of the Israeli Laborers Party thought. More so because to their mind and to their understanding of politics, the Soviets were not the people that they should be relying upon, specifically because the land was under British mandate, and because the British have already issued a statement in support of a founding of a Jewish home in the Mandate of Palestine, and because they were aware enough of British dependence and alliance with the Americans. So they decided that it is better not to hitch their wagon to Stalin and then possibly create friction with both the Brits and the Americans. But how did the Israeli Laborers Party essentially have control over the Jewish settlement in the Mandate of Palestine? Well, they had all sorts of branches or organizations that were at their behest. For one thing, the biggest essentially militia in the Jewish settlement, the Haganah, which would later become the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, was essentially a militaristic branch of the Israeli Laborers Party. So it was essentially under their control. And this would be mostly evident in time that was known as the saison, or hunting season, in which the Haganah took part in actively hunting anti-British militias with the intent of appeasing the Brits. But another branch of the Israeli Laborers Party was the Israeli Laborers Federation. And this federation, you could look at it as a huge, all-encompassing workers' union, essentially. Itself was more than just that. They had under them the entirety of public transportation at the time. They founded one of the first banks in what would become Israel, an insurance company, youth groups, and a newspaper. So that is another way in which the Israeli Laborers Party had control over the Jewish settlement. It should be noted that the Israeli Laborers Federation would figure in very heavily into the reasons why the Israeli Labor Party today is in the condition it is. But we jump a few years into the future, into 48, after the partition plan was placed in effect by the UN. There were some arguments within the socialist groups in Israel with regards to whether or not a state should be founded immediately. And there were some who were afraid of the possible repercussions of war threats by Arab neighbors. But essentially what happened is that the ones for the founding of a state, which was more of really a formality, won out, and there was a war. But for the next decade or so, the dominance of the Israeli Laborers Party was really uncontested. That is not to say that there weren't people contesting it, The biggest group at the time were actually the Marxists, but there was another group, and this one is historically more relevant, which was called the revisionists. And the revisionists essentially were not socialists, were entirely devoted to nationalism, to Zionism, and to the idea of of an Israel from sea to the Jordan River. So Jewish sovereignty over the entirety of the land. It should be noted that some of the Marxists had also the idea of Israeli sovereignty over the entirety of the land, but those were pro a binational state, so one wherein there is a shared type of sovereignty. But at the time, the idea of any of those groups wresting control from the Israeli Laborers' Party was very far from reality. But something happened in the early 50s, and it didn't quite chip at the control of the Israeli Laborers' Party at the time, but it did put into motion several processes that will culminate in the end with the downfall of the Israeli left. And that was known as the Miserable Affair. The Miserable Affair was a clandestine operation that was overseen by the Israeli military intelligence in Egypt. What it entailed essentially were Jewish Egyptian nationals who were trained by the military intelligence to carry out a false flag attack against Western targets in Egypt, with the intent of putting to halt the Brits. Okay, the Brits wanted to pull out of the Sinai, and Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Israeli Laborers' Party, wanted to stop them from doing so. And so this plan was devised. However, what happened was that one of the operatives, his explosives prematurely exploded within his own home, and thus the whole conspiracy was revealed, and the operatives were arrested, and several were executed. Others were taken into custody. What happened was that the Israeli Minister of Defense was fired, and Ben-Gurion, who was a shadow prime minister at the time, after being a prime minister for several years before that, took the office of Minister of Defense, and later on took the reins of power as prime minister back. Um, this is relevant because what happened was that the former Minister of Defense, Pinchas Levon, felt that he was slighted, that he was scapegoated, and the amount of public trust, both in the party and specifically in Ben Gurion, was severely harmed. And later on, in the early 60s, this came to a point with the Pinchas Levon demanding that he be reinstated, and Ben Gurion attempted to stop. Well, essentially, there were two camps within the Israeli Laborers Party in opposition. One primarily led by one named Levi Eshkol and also Pinchas Levon, and the second by the mythical prime minister of Israel and the mythical leader of the party, David Ben Gurion. And David Ben Gurion overestimated his legacy and his power over the party, and he, seeing that he could not win within the party, decided on leaving the party and forming his own. And this party, his party, failed spectacularly in the elections against the Israeli Laborers Party. And not only that, but in 67, the Israeli Laborers Party without Ben Gurion had accomplished the biggest military feat Israel has ever achieved in the War of 67, and thus any chance of Ben Gurion taking control over the party again became a distant idea. What happened, though, is that all of his former supporters who came with him to form the new party had left to go back to the Israeli Laborers Party, to the back home. And at that time, again, it looked like the idea of any party contesting the Israeli Laborers Party was, again, far from reality. But that was 67. And 6 years later, we have the catastrophe of the War of Yom Kippur. And what happened in the War of Yom Kippur deserves its own episode, all to itself. A brief explanation was that there was a spectacular failure of military intelligence, and also a failure of the governing body to discern what military intelligence there was and take it seriously. But what happened was that Israel was surprised by a blitzkrieg by Syria and Egypt, and it was most probably the most devastating war that or at least it is remembered as such, that Israel was part of. It is quite possible that the War of 48 was worse and with heavier casualties, but because the War of 48 is remembered in Israeli shared memory as this War of David against Goliath, of one not even state against the war against 7 Arab armies. Again, there's a lot of hyperboles running around as far as that is concerned, but it is not remembered as a catastrophe, whereas the War of 73 is remembered as such because Israel was just on the cusp of a huge military feat of crippling the Egyptian Air Force and taking the Sinai and really destroying its enemies. So the failure at 73 marked really was marked the shift of trust, of public trust in the Israeli Laborers Party. Now, one thing that is also to be considered here is that it was not just that. Harkening back, I said that the Israeli Laborers Party was socialist, but also Zionist. And that came with a sense of neglect as far as the whole idea of classes and class warfare and the socialist idea of there being no classes. The Israeli Laborers Party was very much a classist party. There was a clear-cut separation of who was fit to rule and the other people. Essentially, who was fit to rule were people of mostly the second Aliyah, mostly people of Eastern European extraction, of Polish or Russian, what used to be the Russian Empire, essentially. Extraction, and these people were really Israeli aristocracy, and all the other Israelis, all the other Jews were relegated to lower classes, and the people who felt the brunt of this the most were primarily Jews from the Arab countries, who, because they came with a very strong sense of cultural identity that was very different from what other Jews from Europe had, both felt more spited, and also because of the cultural differences, they found it harder to assimilate and to prosper. This is not true of all, but for example, European Jews typically had smaller families and thus were able to take care of them better and prosper more financially speaking. Whereas with Jews from Arab countries, this was not the case. They had larger families, and more than that, the state, because of demographic concerns, actually encouraged them in bringing children and creating large families. But these large families were not economically viable. And what happened is that the more than any other demographic in Israel, the Mizrahi Jews from Arab countries, felt that they were being marginalized. And really, one of the maybe most memorable quotes from the election in which the Israeli Labor's Party, back really it was already the Israeli Labor Party at the time, lost its tight grip on the government of Israel, and that was where Menachem Begin, the leader of the of Cherut, or the party that became the Likud, which is the leading party today, he responded to an entertainer who said of the Likud voters that they were just chachchachs. And chachchach is a ethnic derogatory, it's not used anymore, but it's referring essentially to Moroccans. And Begin was wise enough to really latch onto this one entertainer and really say, this is the labor establishment, and this is what they think of you. And he leveraged this into a huge support from Mizrahi Jews, and between this and this distrust in the Labor Party because of the catastrophe of 73, the Labor never recuperated. There were times in which it returned to some power, most memorably in 92 when Yitzhak Rabin took power as Prime Minister of Israel, and then in 97 when Ehud Barak became Prime Minister. No, I'm sorry, that was became the leader of the Labor Party in 97, but became the Prime Minister in 2000. But since Ehud Barak, who I consider to have really have been the final coffin in this party, the Labor Party never returned into power. And what is the condition today, I believe really is the topic for an entire episode about the political environment within the Israeli labor. So that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this little historical overlook about the Israeli Laborers Party and its successor today. And until next time, have an awesome weekend, or what's left of it anyway.